Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We will get started here in a few moments. Welcome, folks. Thanks for coming. We will get started here in a few minutes. In the meantime, if you'd like to add your name and organization to the chat to introduce yourself, feel free to do that. We can see who all is here today. Thanks, everyone, for adding your introduction to the meeting chat. It's nice to see a lot of familiar names and folks from within our Child Care Aware organization and partners in the field, and other folks from our mailing list. Great. We've got 34 people online right now. This is great. We had about 70 reply to RSVP for the event, and it is now 12 o'clock. So I would like to officially get us started to make sure that our guests have plenty of time to go over their topics and answer questions that we have. So my name is Heather Sharmoli, and I'd like to welcome you to the restart of the TEL Talks from Child Care Aware of Minnesota. TEL Talks are topics for early learning leaders, monthly webinars based on interests in our field to help facilitate solutions-focused discussions and to get some questions answered about topics in the early childhood field. What's coming up in the next few months? We will have Jamie Bonzik join us from the Greater Twin Cities United Way in March to share a little bit more about what is happening with the 80x3 Resilient from the Start initiative. In April, Kelly Kazik from DCYF will be here to discuss some resources around outdoor and nature-based programming. And then in May, our friends from the Center for Inclusive Childcare will be joining us to discuss some of their programming opportunities. Child Care Aware of Minnesota helps families find quality childcare programs that best meets their family's needs. In addition, we support the professional growth of early care and education professionals through professional development opportunities, our Eager to Learn platform for online learning, grants, regional grants, retain, teach scholarships. We are the Parent Aware Administrator for coaching and rating. We offer scholarships for CDA. We have the Empower to Educate program, as well as trainer and RVPD support through our office in conjunction with TARS. We also help keep the community informed of the importance of early care and education and advocacy efforts across the state. TELTalk's team today is brought to you by myself, Heather Sharmoli, the Professional Development Systems Coordinator, and Michelle Yang, our Workforce Advising Coordinator. And for those of you who are just joining us, feel free to put your name and organization in the chat so that we can see who's here today. This meeting is being recorded and will be available on our website after the event. We will additionally send recordings out to the folks who have registered for the event, and you can find future events on our website as well. We will be watching the chat and the Q&A functions for questions towards the end of our event. If something comes up in the meantime, feel free to put it into the chat and we'll keep an eye on that so that we can ask Rachel and Suma those questions as we go through the presentation today. If there's anything that needs to cause us to stop our discussion and ask an immediate question. Otherwise, we will save things for the end of their presentation. So with that being said, I would like to introduce our guests today. Rachel Wilensky and Suma Setty from the Center for Law and Social Policy are here to chat with us today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. And thank you all for the amazing work you do to support families with children across the state. Really, this is such an important time. It's always been an important time, but especially now. Next slide, please. I am Suma Setty. I'm a senior policy analyst on the Immigration and Immigrant Families team at CLASP, and I am a public health and public policy researcher, and I manage our team's research portfolio. My colleague Rachel Wilensky is on the call as well. She's a senior policy analyst on the child care and early education team, and I hope that between the two of us, we can answer questions that you may have. Again, thank you for having us here today. Yeah, you can move to, yeah, thank you. So just a little bit about CLASP, the Center for Law and Social Policy. We're based in Washington, D.C., although Rachel and I have deep Minnesota ties. And CLASP has a number of policy focus areas, which are public benefits justice, education, labor, and workplace justice, childcare and early education, and the immigration and immigrant families. Next slide, please. Our immigration team also co-leads a coalition called the Children Thrive Action Network, also known as CTAN. We are a network that formed in 2019, 2020, focusing on children's issues and focusing especially on centering children in mixed status immigrant families. Next slide, please. Thank you. So today I'll just be giving you all an overview of young children of immigrants in the US, as well as the Minnesota context, as well as some recent policy changes. And then I'm going to walk through CLASP's safe space policies and how that can help protect you, your staff, and the families that you serve. Next slide, please. Next slide. So just an overview. 25% of children in the US have at least one foreign-born parent, which varies by state. The darker the state on this map, the higher the proportion of children with at least one foreign-born parent. This is all from census data from 2022. As you can see, Minnesota is kind of smack in the middle of all of the map in terms of its proportion of children in immigrant families. Next slide. So the majority of immigrant families are mixed status, and mixed status, for folks who may not know this term, it just means that there are people with different immigration statuses in the same family. Most commonly, when we're talking about this in this setting, we're talking about parents usually who are undocumented, or at least one of them is undocumented or has a temporary status, and they have US citizen children. We do know that at least 5.2 million children have at least one parent in the US who is undocumented. There are also more than 500,000 US citizen children who have parents with deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA, or temporary protected status. Both are programs that offer legal status to eligible folks, and those both are at risk as well, putting their children at risk. We also have around 700K children under the age of 18 who are also undocumented. We also call them dreamers. We have another 118,000 unaccompanied children who are released to sponsors in the US in fiscal year 2023. Right now, the border is closed and there are no new admissions happening. So the unaccompanied child issue, that's a much more complex issue that I don't need to go into right now. But it seems, but that number will go down this year. Next slide. In Minnesota, 30% of the total child population are under the age of 6, and nearly 1 in 5 children under 6 has at least one foreign-born parent. Nearly 31% of these children with at least one foreign-born parent are under age 6. Only 1% of children under age 6 are foreign-born in Minnesota. Next slide, please. So there are a number of barriers that impact immigrant families' access to public programs. I'm sure many of you all on the call are already familiar with this, but in general, these include lack of awareness, and barriers unique to the immigrant population are linguistic and cultural barriers, confusing immigrant eligibility rules and restrictions, and immigration-related concerns. Next slide. These immigration-related concerns have only been amplified in recent months and weeks due to anti-immigrant rhetoric and sweeping changes to the immigration system. The Trump administration's immigration policies, they have passed a lot of them, either through executive order or through administrative changes, which is just happening at agencies. But they all kind of broadly fall into these 3 categories. So ramping up interior and border enforcement resources and mechanisms. Number 2, stripping protections for immigrants, including access to benefits and services. And number 3, limiting or eliminating legal pathways for those coming to the US, as well as those who are already here. The intention and the effect of all of these actions are to cause fear and chaos across immigrant communities and those who serve them. And so I just want to, I mentioned this to Heather before this call started, but I do know that this is really scary, and there's a lot of anxiety among many providers as well as immigrant communities right now. And it does take, it's been challenging to balance the reality of the situation and being prepared for it with the fear and the confusion and chaos. So I just want to name that tension. I don't have a solution for you all. It's something that I'm also working through, but I do want to know, I do want to share a lot of ways in which we can empower ourselves and the communities that we serve. Next slide, please. So another change that is more relevant to all of you all is the removal of the protected areas policy, which falls within the category of increasing enforcement generally. The Trump administration has rescinded a longstanding policy, which is known as sensitive locations or protected areas. And I'll be using these terms kind of interchangeably throughout this presentation, since this policy has undergone some changes throughout its decade and a half of existence, but they are used synonymously. Next slide. So the protected areas policy, it's an internal Department of Homeland Services policy that's existed in some shape or form since 2010. And it guided ICE and CBP. ICE is Immigration Customs Enforcement, CBP is Customs and Border Protection, to limit their immigration enforcement activities in sensitive or protected areas that are critical to community well-being. So these are places like schools, healthcare centers, disaster relief areas, and of course, childcare centers. The policy guided officers to carry out enforcement activities in these areas only if there were extraordinary threats to public safety or other similar uncommon circumstances. As I mentioned, this protective policy was removed, which unfortunately it was very easy to do because it was just an internal guidance and policy. And they issued a press release, the Trump administration's DHS issued a press release in January that stated immigration officers would instead be encouraged to utilize their common sense when undertaking enforcement actions like apprehending and arresting immigrants. This is incredibly concerning because not only is this intentionally vague, even when the protected areas guidance was in place, there were reports of ICE presence and arrests in and around sensitive locations. Already, we've heard concerns from advocates and providers about the likely chilling effect that this might have on their programs due to the removal of the sensitive locations policy. And we have heard verified reports of immigration enforcement officers on school buses, parents being arrested in front of their children or while running errands for their children. And we've heard that a lot of people are seeing their attendance at childcare centers and facilities decreasing. Regardless of whether or not DHS has a formal policy in place, though, families and care providers should know that they have basic constitutional rights that still apply, regardless of your immigration status, regardless of whether or not there's a protected areas policy in place. And I'll just walk through a couple of impacts, and then I'll walk through the Safe Spaces guide that we have on our website as well. Next slide. I think you all already know what many of the impacts of increased immigration enforcement looks like. Many of you have probably gone through this during the first Trump administration. Next slide, please. So increased immigration enforcement, especially when children witness apprehensions and arrests, is especially traumatizing. And it creates a chilling effect, spreading fear and causing immigrant communities to isolate. They refrain from using critical services like healthcare and childcare. They're pushed further in the shadows. Research has shown that the impacts of these policy changes on children and families are significant. So we did a study during the first Trump administration, and in addition to that study and others, we found that children as young as 3 were worried about losing a parent to deportation. We saw that many folks were withdrawing from community, limiting time spent at parks, libraries, and other public spaces. A lot of folks were were just not showing up to well child visits, delaying or foregoing prenatal care. And we also saw changes in employment and income and mental health impacts on both parents and children. Children who often are showing it in externalizing and internalizing behaviors. Those externalizing behaviors include aggression, social withdrawal, separation anxiety. And again, all of this is the intention of these policies. It is intended to cause fear. It is intended to make immigrants self-deport and push people further into the shadows. And next slide, please. And in terms of the early care and education child force in particular, there have been studies that have looked at what increased immigration enforcement does to the sector in general, as well as to the workforce. And I think, you know, one in five ECE worker is an immigrant. And studies have found that increased immigration enforcement mechanisms reduce children's participation in center-based childcare programs, reduce the supply and wages of immigrant and Native workers, and reduce the number of center-based facilities overall. The impact is likely on family-based and other childcare as well. It's just that the research that exists right now has focused on center-based care. Next slide, please. We've also seen other reports that have shown that increased immigration enforcement leads to lower levels of parent engagement, difficulty connecting families to services, including wraparound services and services that help them meet their basic needs, and difficulty enrolling new families. And this causes a lot of stress. I don't need to tell this group that on program staff. Next slide, please. I think it is important to keep in mind, yes, actually, Rachel and I were on a call yesterday, and we heard the framing of safe spaces being reframed as brave spaces. And I really like that framing because it is brave of everyone on this call and the folks that you work with to show up every day with the threat that immigration authorities may come to your space, especially now that protective policies are no longer in place. Families really trust and rely on providers like you all because you care for their children and you support them in times of need. So it's more important than ever that we get information out there so that you are all informed and prepared, and your partners are informed and prepared, and families are prepared. So we recommend that ECE providers create safe space policies. Next slide. So a safe space policy is a plan to safeguard your program against immigration enforcement and ensure that the safety and privacy of children, parents, and staff are protected. They're rooted in basic security and privacy protocols that you may already have in place, and they can reinforce basic constitutional principles. We do have our guide available on our website, and even though it was recently updated back in January, wow, not that long ago, January was just a few weeks ago, but it feels like years, doesn't it? We plan to update it again by the end of this week, and it will still, like the updated version will still be available at the same link. But I'll spend some time talking through it today, but I also encourage you all to read the full report, which includes more details, as well as this template safe space policy and some scripts. The guide is geared towards center-based childcare and early education programs, but the basic tenets can be applied to other child-serving organizations as well. Next slide, please. Again, these safe space policies are important to support the children that you serve and their families, and ensure that your staff and families feel empowered and supported in situations where there might be uncertainty or they might feel unsafe. Next slide. So some of the main components of a safe space policy, one of the first things you should do is establish staff roles and responsibilities, how staff should interact with federal immigration agents, how you'll minimize disruption of children's learning and routines, how you'll notify parents about the presence of immigration agents in or near the facilities, and how you'll coordinate with other organizations who may share the space, like a building or a single entrance. Next slide. So first, your policy should lay out staff roles and responsibilities should immigration enforcement occur at your program. We recommend identifying at least 2 designated staff members who are responsible for speaking or remaining with the immigration agent. Determine who is responsible for alerting others on-site staff, as well as those off staff of the agent's presence. Also consider whether there are any staff or community partners that should be notified of the agent's visit, and figure out who is responsible for contacting them and how, and then think through if there's anybody else that needs to be notified. Next slide, please. In a safe space policy, you'll also want to provide an overview of how staff are expected to interact with immigration agents. In our safe space guide, we do have some sample scripts that people can draw from in your own policies. First of all, if possible, they should be speaking with the agent outside of the facility. If they're in a public area, you don't have to let them in any space that's considered private or restricted until you have verified their credentials. The staff who's responsible for interacting with the agent should let them know that their program has a procedure that they're required to follow for the safety of children, staff, and parents. This same employee should also ask the agent for their credentials. This includes badge ID number, the agency that they're coming from, written approval from the agent's supervisor permitting access to the facility, the reason for their visit, and a judicial warrant signed by a federal or state judge to enter the facility for this purpose. So I'll go over what a judicial warrant is versus an administrative warrant, and I'll link in some resources later on. So the person who is asking for these credentials should just take their time and make sure they get a copy of all of these documents for the facility's records. It's totally okay to ask the agent to wait while all of this information is being verified and being copied. And the reason why I said earlier that we recommend at least 2 people to be interacting with the agent is so that if somebody needs to make a call or notify folks about the presence of ICE or make copies of these documents, there is also someone remaining with the agent at all times to ensure that they are not moving into spaces they are not yet permitted to enter. If the agent does not have the proper credentials or a warrant to enter the building, you can politely ask him or her to leave. It's a good idea to have a few scripted sentences because in the moment it can be really scary and difficult. And what we're hearing from the field is that agents can be very pushy and manipulative. So you just have to remain firm, stand firm, recommend that you identify folks who can handle this kind of interaction, or you can also practice through role play. I think that's also a great way to prepare staff. If you're a childcare early learning program, I recommend, which everyone is, sorry, this is just in my script. I recommend reminding the officer that as an early childhood program, they are in a secure private facility. You can tell them that their presence at the facility is disruptive to the normal operations of the program, and you can request that they leave immediately. In any event, staff should remain calm, and staff should never physically interfere with an agent or take any actions that could threaten their safety under any circumstances. Next slide, please. Okay, so a judicial warrant versus an administrative request or warrant. So a judicial warrant must be signed by a judge, and it must say U.S. District Court or State Court at the top. Sometimes ICE agents try to use an administrative warrant to enter, but an administrative warrant does not allow agents to enter private areas without your permission. Your facility can be considered a private area. Administrative warrants are not from a court. They usually say Department of Homeland Security and are on forms I-200 or I-205, and I'll link another resource. Again, it's make sure you get a copy of these documents and make sure you read through the warrant to understand what the scope of the search or whatever, making sure that a search of the facility is on there. If it's not on there, then point that out to the agent if they try to enter. Next slide. Your policy should also lay out expectations for staff who are working directly with children. Again, like I mentioned before, you should minimize disruptions to children's routine as much as possible and prioritize keeping children away and out of sight of an agent. This could think through scenarios like what staff should do if an agent shows up while children are on the playground, taking a restroom break, or are otherwise out of the classroom while an agent is present. Next slide. There's also should be a plan to notify parents that an agent is present on site and steps that you're taking to protect children's safety and their private information. You should also alert parents when the agent has left the premises. In terms of secure messaging, I recommend that you use whatever messaging system you already have in place. But I also, I'll put in a plug for Signal as a secure messaging app. This is an end-to-end encrypted messaging platform. Although more people and parents included, especially in the immigrant community, might be more familiar with WhatsApp, which also provides end-to-end encryption, although some people may not feel comfortable with their data being shared with Meta. Next slide, please. Speaking of data privacy, staff should only collect information that's necessary for enrollment or educational purposes. There's no reason to collect information on country of origin or on immigration status directly. And this information should be stored in, especially identifying information, should be stored in a secure database and not disclosed to anyone outside of your facility without a court order or parents' consent. Next slide. So it's also incredibly important to educate your staff and parents that the U.S. Constitution offers all individuals protection in all locations, no matter they are a U.S. citizen or not. Under the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, you have the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures of persons and objects, which is why it's very important to read through a judicial warrant very carefully to make sure that it is that the agent sticks to whatever is in the warrant, whatever facilities that are being outlined in there. The Fifth Amendment ensures your right to remain silent when confronted by law enforcement. Next slide. So other recommendations include marking all childcare spaces and facilities with signs marked private. The more controlled the environment of the facility is, such as requiring individuals to pass through certain areas before entering and marking areas private, the easier it is to enforce these constitutional rights. The policy should also indicate how you'll make it available to parents and staff, how staff will be trained on this policy, and how often it will be revised and updated. I recommend also allowing for a lot of flexibility to incorporate feedback from parents and staff as they become familiar with the policies. You might want to also consider including resources for staff members and parents, such as an overview of information on Know Your Rights and family emergency planning in case of parental deportation. Finally, it is important to keep in mind that agents are more likely to be near your program than they are to come and knock on your door. Although the environment is changing constantly, so it's unclear to say anything with certainty. And your safe space policy can also include procedures to follow if immigration authorities are near your center, or you become aware of a home or a worksite raid taking place in the surrounding community. If staff become aware that ICE or CBP agents are in the neighborhood, you should take precautions, such as bringing children inside. If the playground is visible from the street, consider alerting parents and revising drop-off or pickup procedures. If necessary, contact an immigrant rights organization in your community for support. Next slide, please. Like I mentioned, we have updated and will be continually updating our Safe Spaces Guide for childcare providers on how they can develop these internal policies and procedures. We are also conducting a webinar with the National Immigrant Legal Center, or NILC, to share more information with childcare providers on Tuesday, February 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern, and we will be recording the conversation. We haven't yet opened the event to registration, but we will send out that information. We'll share that information with Heather, so Heather can share this out to you all as well. We're also discussing the possibility of another webinar in partnership with parent-led groups to educate parents on their rights and how they can help prepare. We also have a rapid response resources page, which is continually being updated with resources for ECE providers, K through 12, for parents to support mental health and stakeholders in higher education. It includes talking points on immigration topics as well. Next slide, please. So these are our big takeaways. Like I mentioned before, these anti-immigrant policies are spreading a lot of fear and misinformation in our communities, but there are steps that you all can take to protect yourselves and protect the safety of your employees, as well as the kids and the families that you serve. There are other advocacy opportunities as well. Can you change the slide, please? Thank you. I do want to be cautious with these advocacy opportunities. I feel like childcare providers are already doing so much to support their families. This slide is kind of left over from other providers and advocates. And if people do feel compelled to do more and above and beyond, these are ways to take action, documenting and uplifting the impact of anti-immigrant policies. When that occurs, I do also want to caution on data privacy and making sure families feel safe, making sure you don't collect any identifying data that might put anybody in harm's way. But I just really want to thank you all for the work that you do. Next slide. And I really appreciate Heather reaching out to have us share this information, and hopefully we can answer some of your questions. Feel free to reach out to me or Rachel if you do have additional questions. But if it's about the webinar, that is coming soon. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Suma. And I see a comment in our chat that says if your location is on property owned by somebody else, rented or leased space in another building, you can let them know that you need to contact your property owner prior to them being allowed to enter. So that is something else to keep in mind, depending on where your property is located. And somebody asked a question, will you be able to provide an example of a legal judicial warrant? There are some non-legal warrants floating around out there. So
Yeah,
do
I
you,
can. So I will say I am not a lawyer, and so I'm going to share a resource with you all from a group that has some of these examples in this report. It's from Make the Road, New York. That is an excellent question, and I want to make sure that do that. So in the chat, I will put in. So a lot of these resources are a little buried, but that's only to protect these resources from being targeted and taken down. So the link that I just put in the chat, you'll have to enter your email address in order to download the deportation defense manual. But on the in this manual, there is an example of a legal judicial warrant, as well as an example of an administrative warrant, and you can clearly see the differences between the two.
I'm also adding into the chat the link for the Safe Spaces Guide, which again, that link will be updated with the updated report when that is available. So that link will be good. The article that kind of brought Suma and Rachel to our attention, I'm going to copy that and put that in the chat as well. I just think that it's a really good read, and it does also link to the Safe Spaces Guide as well. So feel free to put in the chat and put any other questions out there. Thank you, Suma, for your additional information.
I forgot to put in the link, but here it is.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions coming through, but while we're waiting, Suma and Rachel, I know you had mentioned a couple of other opportunities. Could you go over those again?
Yeah, Rachel, do you want to talk? I feel like I would love to not talk.
Yes, I can kick us off. So Heather, are you referencing opportunities to take action and upcoming events? Is that what you're
Yes.
looking for? Great. Yes, so on Tuesday, February 25th at 12 p.m. Central Time, we will be hosting another webinar. A lot of what you've heard today will probably be covered again, but it'll be another opportunity to dig in and go a little deeper on some of these things. It is geared towards the early education community and focusing on how to support families and providers during this time. So that'll be on the 25th, and we will share the registration for that when it becomes available. I can, Suma, I defer, yeah, I'm happy to speak about it, but I defer to you on how much to share about other things we have ongoing, as many are still in development, and I wanted to check with you.
No, thanks. Sorry for putting you on the spot there, but thank you for doing that. And I just want to also mention that the webinar on the 25th will also include a lawyer from the National Immigration Law Center, and they will be able to speak to any legal questions that folks might have. I also wanted to mention that if folks are interested in more advocacy opportunities, there is an opportunity right now. We're collecting organizational sign-ons for a letter supporting the Protecting Sensitive Locations Act, which is an act of Congress, and it basically reinstates the protected areas policy. This was introduced by Senator Blumenthal of Massachusetts and Representative Espaillat, I think, of New York. Is that right? Thank you, Rachel. I'm not a ledge person, but it is an amazing bill. It's like one of the few positive immigration bills that are in Congress right now. Everything else is incredibly damaging and harmful to immigrant families and children. And so if it's possible, I encourage you all to read more about it, contact your organization to see if you can sign on. If you do want to sign on, you can always email me for the form. And I'll put my email in the chat.
And I can just share, Suma, you spoke so clearly in the presentation about how the policy that was recently rescinded for protected areas, right, was so easily taken away because it was just an internal departmental policy. So this proposed legislation in Congress is just meant to codify that policy into law. So this is policy that has existed in this tentative way for, over a decade. And this legislation would essentially just say, okay, instead of having this be an internal department policy that can just change every administration or whenever someone wants it to, this would codify it into law. So it would make it, still changeable if someone wanted to, if Congress wanted to, but would make it a little more difficult to change and give folks a little more notice of the change. And I know Minnesotans are very civically engaged. And so, this is certainly something you can call your representative about if you want them to support it as well. And but certainly, yes, we are also collecting organizational endorsements of the legislation. And I see Suma shared that. There's a description at the link at Suma shared in the chat as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. We do have a couple of other questions that have come up. First of which, have there been any reports of ICE going into schools or childcare centers in recent weeks?
Yeah, so there have been a lot of rumors floating around, but we did have some verified reports of CBP actually boarding a school bus in Oregon, and also immigration authorities going into schools in Texas. So these are this is definitely a real threat, and something that we have the tools to protect ourselves against.
Another comment that was made following the current NAEYC policy agenda, in case people want to reach out to their elected officials, it says protected young children and their families from the traumatic harms brought by family separation. Early childhood educators have an ethical obligation to stand against policies that are emotionally damaging, physically harmful, disrespectful, degrading, dangerous, exploitive, I should say, or intimidating to children. As administration and Congress consider new actions related to immigration, we urge them to prioritize the well-being of children and not implement policies that would harm children by separating them from their families. And there is a link to the NAEYC federal policy agenda for 2025, a link in Jamie Bonzik's link there. And then thank you, Jamie, for sharing that. Back to questions, a question specifically about playgrounds. Are playgrounds an extension of the building as a secure area, even if they're only accessible from the outside and the gates are not locked due to licensing requirements?
Actually, we'll have to get back to you on that question. Rachel, I'm not sure if you know the answer to that.
Not with a legal authority to say so, but I would say it sounds like you can say the play like we've discussed, like you can share that what spaces are private. You could put up a sign that the playground is a private space. However, I think it is like we were talking about, there aren't exactly safe spaces anymore, so I would still consider it like the whole location, nothing is protected, right? So it is still an area where enforcement could come if they have a valid judicial warrant and it says, it includes the places to search include a playground, they would be able to enter there. I think it's just if they are not operating under a valid judicial warrant or it's not included, having it marked as private will be helpful to you in that moment.
Yeah, this is definitely a question that we can also take back to our partners at NILC. And we can also, we are running a protected areas working group, and we can ask that group as well, which has many lawyers on staff. I also recommend that you reach out to the leadership in your child care facility. Maybe they might have answers to that as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Even though it's not super clear, it's helpful to have a little bit of guidance. Um, Another question that just came up, realistically, what would ICE be looking for? A person who is undocumented?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, to be honest. Like, with any certainty, I can make some guesses about what they're going to be looking for. My assumption is that they are probably, yeah, they are looking for people who are undocumented. They might be interested in an employee at your childcare facility. They might be interested in a parent of a child that attends your program. So I do think that that's what they're looking for.
And I can add, Suma, not necessarily just the physical person, right? So data as well, which is why we discussed how important it is to keep your data secure. They may come looking for an address, trying to get more information about where a person might be located. So making sure you protect that data, or if, looking to see if some places have documentation of, if families are citizen families or not. That's all information that they could be seeking.
Yeah, and again, like without a court order or the parent's consent, you do not have to share any of that data or information.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, let me see. Did I miss any other questions? I don't see any else that are coming up. We're coming towards the end of our allotted time, but we do have a couple of extra minutes. We'll hang out and see if there's any other questions that pop up. And while we're waiting, I just want to thank you again so much, both of you, for being here and sharing all of this information with our audiences. This is an incredibly timely and important context. And I love the suggestions that you have about having some script lines ready, doing some role playing, and creating those policies in advance and thinking through what all steps need to be taken. That's just so incredibly helpful and important for providers to be able to have those resources available so they know what they can and do not have the permissions legally to do in some of these instances, because this is just outside of what I think we've normally dealt with, and that always makes people uneasy. But this helps give us some guidance on how we can protect the children and the staff in our programs and the families to keep them safe and calm during some of these challenging situations.
Yeah, for sure. And I also just wanted to offer CLASP as a resource. Definitely reach out to us if you would like us to review a draft policy, if you would have additional questions. Even if we don't know the answers, we do have a lot of partners working in this space that we can consult on your questions and get back to you for sure. I also saw that someone said that they have an example of a Hennepin County warrant and also a federal warrant. Um, Kristen, I think that would be wonderful to share because I think the local context matters. Knowing what it looks like is definitely important.
Thank you. I missed that one. Thanks, Kristen, for offering to share that.
And I think as much as you all can share best practices and policies with each other, I think that would be really useful to you all. And also, if you have time, because I'm sure you all do, um, sharing sharing any feedback that you might have on our safe space guide to make it stronger and more applicable to more folks would be great too.
Yeah, absolutely. thanks again for sharing that resource and keeping it updated, even though it was just updated last month. Just knowing that you guys are putting forth the effort to update it again so soon to follow what's happening is incredibly helpful, and affirming that we know that resource is going to be available. Another question that just popped up is there anything special we can do with buses if we transport children, or just the same thing as marking them as private?
Yeah. I would have to, again, go back to our partners to ask about that. I think marking any space where there are children as private is good practice. I'm going to copy and paste some of these questions that I can't directly answer, and try to get back to you on the answers with. I'll just reach out to you, Heather, directly.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. And I will look to get back to figuring out how I can disseminate that information, because we will have this recording on our website, but people can email me specifically at heatherc@childcareawaremn.org with questions. There's another note in here. Make sure to inform staff that if they don't recognize somebody at the door, instead of letting them in right away, ask questions through the door. Do not open the door prior to verifying who it is and their legal right to enter. So like, just kind of reinforcing what you guys had said before, we have the right to ask them to wait while we verify their documentation and identification before we let them into the building. I imagine they get pushback, and this would not be the first time that they would be experiencing this, but I think it's really important to, and Suma, you had such great suggestion to make sure that the person who's going to the door can be that person that says, no, I can't let you in, because sometimes they can be really pushy, and that can be hard to stand up against somebody who's trying to get into the door. But when we're working on keeping our children safe, it's important to have somebody who is going to stand their ground and not let people into the building without verifying everything first.
Yeah, I will also say that ICE and CBP often say that they are with police, which is why it's really important to ask what agency they're from. And if they say Hennepin County Police or something, that's a different story. But by clarifying what agency they're from, I think you get you understand what your rights are. It's very different with immigration authorities than with regular county police.
Yeah, that's a really great example. Okay. I don't see any other questions coming through, and we're just at the bottom of, well, top of the hour, I guess, the end of our time together. So I want to take another moment to thank Suma and Rachel for being here today, and all of the work that you are doing on behalf of children and families, so that we can work and do our work here in Minnesota, keep children and families safe and healthy and cared for and educated. And thank you for your partnership. There's lots of thanks coming up in the chat as well. And for future opportunities, if things are changing again, we may reach out and invite you to come back and share. And we appreciate your time today joining us from Texas and Washington as you guys are coming to us today.
Thank you all. Really appreciate the work that you all do.
All right. Take care, everyone.